2 years ago, conflict gripped Ukraine from within and without, as domestic opposition deposed the president and Russia occupied Crimea. For some new perspective on those events, we welcome, from New Haven, Connecticut, Timothy Snyder. He's professor of Central European History at Yale University. He joins us now for 10 questions on Ukraine. Okay, Professor Snyder, question one. Why have you become such a strong defender of Ukraine in its conflict with Russia?
I don't like it when there's too much lying. And the beginning of the events in Ukraine, which we're describing, that is the protests in favor of moving closer to the European Union, which are the start of all of this, the violent response of the government, the dictatorship laws of the government of February 2014, then Russia's invasion of Crimea. These events were happening on a scale that I could understand because I knew people who were present in Kiev during the protests. I knew people who were out in the east, and also I know the language, which is fairly unusual, and I traveled to the place. Those seem like simple things, but almost no one who comments on Ukraine who's not Ukrainian knows the Ukrainian language. And I don't want to mention people by names, but basically everybody who comments on these things in North America does not go to Ukraine, which I think is a big problem.
Having said that, question two. You have said the Ukrainian Revolution has been misunderstood and betrayed. How so?
The fundamental thing that happened in Ukraine is that more than 1 million people mobilized, overcame government violence in order to do a very simple thing, in order for their government to sign agreements with the European Union, which they hoped would make normal middle-class rule of law existence possible. This was a revolution, and it was a revolution which probably should have enjoyed a lot more sympathy than it did enjoy on behalf of people who were in favor of middle-class existence, the rule of law, and things like this. For a lot of reasons having to do with ignorance and narcissism, as well as propaganda, we've characterized it in other ways. Now, even if you don't care about the Ukrainians, you might care about world order and about the European order. And the Russian idea, or the Putin's idea, that it's legitimate to invade countries, violate international borders, violate very important agreements from the UN Foundation Charter all the way through the Budapest Memorandum and basically every treaty signed between Ukraine and Russia. The idea that law doesn't matter and borders don't matter is a very dangerous idea for all of Europe and for the Western order as such. So even if you don't care about Ukraine, paying attention to the Ukrainian state is probably something that makes sense.
Question three. Vladimir Putin claims that the Maidan Revolution of 2013 was essentially a U.S.-backed putsch against the legitimate rule of President Yanukovych. What do you say to that?
There is no evidence of that whatsoever, and anyone who spent time among those people or who knew those people would remember something which is very close to the contrary. While those protests were going on, which remember had the very simple goal of moving Ukraine closer to the European Union, the anti-Americanism was stronger from day to day on the streets. Why? Because the United States wasn't doing anything to support people who were risking their lives in the name of the rule of law. It was only after Russia invades, I should say, that the Ukrainians have to accept the Americans, basically faute mieux. The Americans and the Europeans are against Russia intervening in Ukraine, and so de facto they become allies after the Russian invasion.
Question four. The Russians also say that there were fascist organizations such as Svoboda and Right Sector that played a role in all of this. Are they right about that?
The right in Ukraine, according to electoral results and sociological polling, has less resonance than in any major European country, including the democracies where this kind of idea of criticizing Ukraine is so popular. So it's much less important than in Belgium, the Netherlands, France. Anywhere you care to go, right-wing populism is more important than it is in Ukraine.
Question five. Is the Russian-speaking East and the Ukrainian-speaking West reflective of the political division between pro-Russian and pro-European policies in Ukraine?
No. I mean, Ukraine has regional political differentiation like the United States, actually much like the United States, like Italy, like Canada, but not more so. And it's simply not the case that language predicts where people stand politically. I would turn the question around and point out that Ukraine is actually a bilingual polity. This is something that Americans and Russians have trouble understanding because we are not bilingual polities. Ukraine is much more than I think even Belgium or Switzerland or Canada. which means that, for example, Ukrainian-speaking soldiers from the West don't have any trouble speaking Russian when they go to the East. It means that protesters who stood up on the stage and gave a speech in Ukrainian might go back and ask their friends how it went in Russian. So you can't divide the country into a Russian-speaking half and a Ukrainian-speaking half because it's a bilingual country.
Question 6. How would you characterize the current state of affairs between Russia and Ukraine?
The initial hope seems to have been that with Russian intervention, the Ukrainian state would just collapse and there would be lots of popular support for Russia. That didn't happen. The Ukrainian state has big problems, but it did not collapse. And the Russian intervention actually flipped Ukrainian public opinion against Russia. So what Russia seems to be doing now, this could change. What seems to be doing now is hunkering down and trying to make the parts of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast that they control classic sort of frozen conflict, failed state type territories, so that the West will say, well, we can't do anything with Ukraine because they have this territory occupied by Russia. That's of course fallacious, right? You can have Ukraine moving towards the West, even if some of it's under Russian control. After all, the whole European project, the whole project of NATO, begins with Germany, which was divided at the time that it began. So there's no reason why, in fact, it's very important that reforms continue on the territory of Ukraine, which is controlled by the government in Kiev, the legitimate democratic government in Kiev.
Question 7 is about corruption. The Corruption Perception Index ranks Ukraine 142nd. Out of 175 countries in the world, Russia is not much better. It's at 136. But let's ask about Ukraine. Why is it still so corrupt?
This is the key question, okay? The reason why people go out on the Maidan and risk their lives is not that they don't like Russia. It's not that they like America. It is that they want corruption to stop so they can have normal lives where their children can do better than they are doing. That is what they want. It's very much a middle-class type revolution at its heart. The Maidan's answer to that question is, let's get closer to Europe because the Europeans have shown that there's a template, there's a model for rule of law states. You can answer the question of corruption in a different way, and that's the Russian way. You can say the answer to corruption is to have one main corrupt person at the center, have him break all the other oligarchs and impose a certain kind of order. And what we're seeing now is a competition between those two ideas.
Question 8. Do you imagine in the next 25 years, let's say, that Ukraine will return to being a single, unified state?
I think it's important not to make things too contingent upon that, whether you're a Ukrainian or whether you're a European. The important issue is, can Ukraine carry out fundamental reforms supporting the rule of law on the vast majority of the country which it currently controls? If it does that, I think the other territorial questions will solve themselves, because then Ukraine will be so much more attractive than a Russian Crimea or a Russian-dominated Southeast. It's important to remember that the vast majority of the country is under the control of the central government. I think that's the real question. Can that part be reformed? If so, I think everything else will sort itself out.
Okay, but humor me then for question 9. Do you imagine that Crimea will be returned to Ukraine someday?
I wouldn't want to predict one way or the other, but I would stress that it is legally part of Ukraine now. There is no one essentially in the world who recognizes invasion and unilateral annexation as a legitimate way to take territory. This is the only time this has happened in Europe since the Second World War. I think, though, that it's the kind of thing which will result from, as we said before, basic changes in Ukraine and basic changes in Russia. It will take a Russian regime which has a different idea of its own interests than the current regime.
Question 10. Let's finish up with this. This was a very big story for a very long time, seizing much of the world's attention. It is not anymore. Do you feel increasingly alone in your support for Ukraine?
No, I don't, but if you're asking me personally, no, I don't feel alone. I mean, I feel wonderfully surrounded by lots of extremely interested Ukrainians and Russians, for that matter, who share my views and support them. And trying to get things right, you make the right kinds of friends. So no, not at all.
Timothy Snyder from Yale University, thanks for answering our 10 questions about Ukraine. Good night.
My pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.